Hello, Elm Street Warrior here with another video, and today I'm going to be concluding my horror movie collection with my Blu-ray side. Blu-rays, I must say, I wasn't interested in them originally. I started collecting them in 2020, actually a couple months before the pandemic, and originally I wasn't into them because I felt like they were too small. But once I started collecting one, it just became addicting real fast, and here we are, 2022 with all these Blu-rays. So without further ado, let's get into it and conclude this trilogy. Okay, so guys, I'm actually going to start from the bottom this time and go all the way up to the top. So I'm just going to do it a little bit differently. But let's start off with Bride of Reanimator. Pretty good sequel, not on the same level as the first one, but hey, not a bad movie by any means. Next up, The Hills Have Eyes. As I've said in previous videos, I actually prefer the remake more. I kind of just bought this steelbook because it was at a local FYE that closed near me for $9, and I kind of just took advantage of it. Next up, Trick or Treat. Really enjoyed this anthology horror film, and it really nails the Halloween vibe, I feel like. All stories were great, and just an awesome film to watch Halloween season. Next up, Annabelle. Really didn't mind this one. I actually found the doll Annabelle to be pretty creepy. Next up, Salem's Lot. Pretty boring movie in my opinion, and I found all of the characters to be pretty useless for the most part in my opinion. Next up, Gremlins. Very rare in my movie collection that it's a family-friendly film, but with that being said, not a bad movie at all to watch near Christmas season. Gizmo was pretty adorable, I thought. Next up, Stephen King's It. Tim Curry's performance as Pennywise, nightmare fuel as a kid. Just an awesome 90s horror miniseries. I actually like part 1 more than I do part 2, though. Next up, Nightmare on Elm Street, the remake. Really just took advantage of this too and bought it for $9. Not a fan of this remake by any means. However, the cover art is absolutely glorious. Next up, Halloween 2018. As I've said before in other videos, really loved this sequel and is in my top 5 in the Halloween franchise. Next up, Pitch Black. I have not watched this one yet. It kind of just was a blind buy, but I'm going to pop it in soon. Next up, Terrifier. Absolutely loved this movie. Art the Clown was a force to be reckoned with. I absolutely cannot wait for Terrifier 2. Next up, Piranha. I have not watched this one yet, but I'm sure I'm going to get to it soon. Humanoids from the Deep up next. Really didn't mind this one. Pretty fun 80s film. I love the creature designs in this film. And ladies, you might want to stay away from the beach after watching this movie. Next up, My Bloody Valentine. An 80s glorious slasher that is just fun from the kills to the atmosphere. And the ending just sends chills up my spine each time I watch it. Next up, Train to Busan. Pretty good zombie film. I had a lot of my Instagram followers put me onto this movie, and I absolutely loved it. Next up, Spiral. As I've said in other videos, I am not a huge fan of Saw, but with that being said, this was pretty good. I actually was surprised that I really liked it. Next up, Quiet Place Part 2. Didn't mind this one at all. Not the best films for being PG-13, but with that being said, A Quiet Place is pretty decent. Next up, Resident Evil 2002. After watching the atrociousness Welcome to Raccoon City, I actually appreciate this film way more than I did previously. And last but not least for the Steelbooks, Old. Really enjoyed this movie for the most part, surprisingly. This was another one that I really had no intentions of watching, but ended up really enjoying it by the end of the movie. Next up, Annabellum. Pretty good movie, and I'm not the biggest Jordan Peele fan, but I really like the statement that this movie had to say about ignore the past and you'll end up repeating it. Next up, The Haunt. Pretty good movie. I wouldn't necessarily call it a horror movie. It really kind of gave me They Live vibes because it had a huge political statement, but very good movie. The carnage count in this movie is very high. Next up, Happy Death Day. A pretty decent PG-13 slasher. Kind of a bit hokey in my opinion, but with that being said, not bad. Next up, The Prodigy. Really enjoyed this one. This kid was something else. I'm not going to give away the twist for anyone that's not watched it, but I definitely recommend The Prodigy. Next up, Hocus Pocus. I know, y'all, it's not a horror movie, but it's my favorite shouldn't say horror movie, favorite movie to watch Halloween season, and I like to just pop it in. Next up, House at the End of the Street. Really didn't mind this one for it being a PG-13 horror film. There are some that I can deal with, and this was one of them. Next up, Unhinged. Very good. This gave me Duel vibes, except Russell Crowe was worse. Absolutely what it just sounds like, Unhinged. Definitely a crazy and fun film. Next up, King of Horror Collection. Stephen King's It, The Shining, Salem's Lot, and Cat's Eye. I've watched 3 out of the 4, and the one that I have not watched is Cat's Eye. I'm sure I'll pop it in soon. Again, I'm not that big on anthology horror, unfortunately. Next up, The Craft Legacy. I'm going to get a lot of hate for saying this, but I actually enjoyed The Craft Legacy. While it doesn't come close to replicating the original, absolutely pretty good on its own right. Next up, Howling Village. Did not mind this one. Japanese ghost stories are always a lot of fun to watch because they are very effective. Next up, Henry, Portrait of a Serial Killer. Really didn't mind this one at all. I honestly cannot watch this movie too many times because the grittiness and disturbingness of it is really real. Tom Tolles and Michael Rooker puts on a performance you will never forget. Next up, House of the Devil. I remember watching this one a long time ago, and I really wasn't a huge fan of it. I said I'm going to give it the rewatch treatment soon, though, because my opinion might have changed over years. Next up, The Stuff. I really enjoy this one, and I feel like this is an 80s film that does not get enough credit, in my opinion. Just a lot of fun, and I know it's not really meant to be taken seriously, but I still really love this film. Next up, House. Pretty decent 80s horror film. My favorite part of this, honestly, is Big Man. Next up, The Initiation. A slow burn slasher that pays off. Really good. You know, it's slow, but it does pay off by the end. Really love The Initiation. Next up, The Mutilator. You know, I watched this the first time a couple years ago, and I really enjoyed it. And then I recently rewatched it about a year or two ago, and I really wasn't feeling it. I don't know, but with that being said, I love the cover art and love the music by Buddy Cooper in this. Just absolutely rad. Next up, Doom Asylum. Absolutely love this one. And it is not meant to be taken seriously by any means, but just a fun B-horror slasher film all the way. Next up, Frankenhooker. Really enjoyed this one as well, you know, and it has the same lady from Doom Asylum, Patty Mullen. Just a lot of fun. Next up, Edge of the Axe. Really wasn't that big on this one. I pretty much only enjoyed the kills and the killer reveal. Everything else was kind of background noise to me. Next up, Elvira, Mistress of the Dark. Love, love, love Elvira, Mistress of the Dark. It is just a horror film that is really coming of age, and I really just love this one. Next, we have Blood Rage. You know, this was a movie I really wasn't a huge fan of. I kind of just bought this because it was $14.99 in an Arrow sale, and I kind of just went with it. The kills in it aren't bad, but the acting in this is just really rather cringy. Next up, we have The Beyond. Really didn't mind this one. Definitely one of my favorite Lucio Fulci films. The zombies in this are a force to be reckoned with. Next up, In Search of Darkness Part 2. Didn't mind this one. It actually gets more into 80s horror just in depth. Next up, Texas Chainsaw Massacre 3D. Didn't mind this one at all. And this is a Texas Chainsaw no one talks about, but I absolutely did not mind this one. I actually really enjoyed it. Next up, Unsane. I have not watched this yet, actually. This is a blind buy, but I need to pop it in soon. I got it when Family Video closed, unfortunately. Next up, The Terminator. I know some might disagree, some might agree, but I consider this a slasher movie in its own right, just a sci-fi slasher. Next up, The Mortuary Collection, an anthology horror film that I actually really, really enjoyed. Next up, Son, another one that was pretty good. And speaking of the Mortuary Collection, I watched this and the Mortuary Collection on Shudder and enjoyed them both. The leading girl from Halloween 2018, Allison, Adi Manichak, does a really good job in this film as well. Next up, Jacob's Wife, another one that I watched on Shudder with Barbara Crampton and really, really enjoyed it. Next up, Final Destination 5, the only Final Destination in the franchise that is my least favorite. I like 1 through 4, but this one was kind of weak to me. Next up, Conjuring 3, The Devil Made Me Do It. I actually enjoyed this Conjuring a lot, and I actually liked it a lot better than the first one, unpopular opinion. Next up, Malignant. Really enjoyed this movie. This movie I thought was going to be one thing, and it was something completely different. Next up, Candyman Day of the Dead. I just bought this one a couple days ago, actually. I've not watched this Candyman yet. I've heard terrible things, which I'm sure is true to some extent, but I'll pop it in soon. Next up, Candyman 2021. Actually, really did not mind this Candyman at all. I really thought it was a breath of fresh air. Next up, Spell. A pretty good movie. I basically consider this a voodoo version of Misery. Next up, Happy Birthday to Me. I really didn't care for this movie. I thought it was boring for the most part, and then they say on the cover art 6 of the most bizarre murders you'll ever see, but I honestly thought they were all very simplistic. Next up, Freaky. Really enjoyed this one a lot, and I honestly like it more than I do Happy Death Day. Just a lot of fun. The kills are a lot of fun, and Vince Vaughn absolutely does an amazing job in this movie. Next up, The Collection. Pretty good sequel to The Collector. This one is honestly way more bloodier, and the body count in this movie is insane. Next up, Annabelle Comes Home. I've not watched this one yet, but I'm sure I'll like it because I really liked the first Annabelle film a lot. Next up, 47 Meters Down. Really enjoyed this one. This was another PG-13 horror film that was really good. Those sharks really were not playing. Next up, Possessor. You know, I am not a huge fan of David Cronenberg's movies. I know this was actually directed by his son, but I actually enjoyed Possessor. Possessor was actually a different kind of movie. This one fell. Next up, The Possession. This is another one that's pretty good. Very underrated, guys, and it has Negan from The Walking Dead. I definitely recommend to check this one out because it was pretty good. Oh, go back in there. Next up, and now we get to my favorite section of them all. My Scream Factories. Okay, let's start with Night of the Comet. Not a bad movie. You know, it is kind of slow in some parts. Basically about the last two teenage girls on Earth. But not a bad 80s horror film. I'm a sucker, so. Next up, Firestarter. I've not watched this in a long time. I know this kind of could be a hit or miss Stephen King film. Some people like it, some people don't. I've not rewatched it in a long time, but I need to soon. Next up, Sleepaway Camp. Kind of rebought this one. I already had it in my DVD collection. Not a bad starter film. Y'all already know I prefer the sequel more. Next up, Terror in the Aisles. Didn't mind this one at all either. Basically an 80s horror documentary, except this one is unique because it features clips from different horror films. Next up, Tales from the Crypt and Vaults of Horror double feature. I've not watched either one of these yet. Of course, I've watched the Tales from the Crypt, the series, but I've not watched the actual movie yet. Next up, Cellar Dweller. I've watched Cellar Dweller. I've not watched Catacomb. Cellar Dweller wasn't bad. I liked only the effects in the movie. Other than that, I found the actual plot pretty boring. Next up, Witchboard. A pretty fun one with Tawny Katan from the 80s. It's about these guys that play with this Ouija board, and they get way more than what they asked for. But that being said, really enjoyed Witchboard. Next up, Final Exam. A pretty boring 80s slasher flick. I honestly was not too impressed with this one. Next up, Terror Vision in the Video Dead. Dug both films for the most part, especially Terror Vision. Terror Vision is a weird but very fun ride. Really enjoyed Terror Vision, especially out of that one. Next up, The Final Tear. You know what? Out of all of the summer camp slasher movies, this one really does truly have that stuck in the woods camp vibe. It's not the greatest film by any means, but I did not mind A Final Tear. Next up, Brain Scan with Edward Furlong. Pretty good. I absolutely love the music in this movie. Next up, The Brain. Pretty weird movie. I honestly don't even know what to say about this one. I liked it, but it's very weird. Next up, Jeepers Creepers 1 and 2. Not the biggest fan of these films. I kind of just fought this because I found it at a local entertainment store for $5. I know, I always find something for $5, guys. Next up, Eight-Legged Freaks. Oh, I absolutely hate spiders. This is a movie I cannot watch that often because my arachnophobia is real. Next up, The Poughkeepsie Tapes. Really enjoyed this one. Very, very disturbing. And although they say this wasn't based on a true story, I honestly feel like it was. Next up, The Car. Really didn't mind this one. I must say, before there was Christine, there was The Car. Oh, next one. Next, The Undertaker. Joe Spinell, just disturbing in this movie as he was in Maniac, honestly. Very good movie. I consider this Maniac's little brother. Next up, Jack Frost, a ridiculous 90s horror film that is to not be taken seriously at all. Next up, Pledge Night, a pretty fun 90s horror flick. You know, I know some people might like it or not like it, but I really enjoyed Pledge Night. Next up, Shockwaves, a pretty creepy zombie film. I honestly found the Nazi zombies in this film terrifying. Next up, Sinister. Really did not care for this one at all. I found it pretty boring. Next up, The Night of the Demons 2010 remake. Really enjoyed this one. While it doesn't cut close to the 80s one, pretty still fun movie. Next up, The Uninvited. I really enjoyed this movie as well. Definitely a movie that has an amazing twist at the end of it. Next up, we have Animal. Definitely plays out like a slasher film about a bunch of kids who go in the woods and start being killed off by these creatures. Next up, Elvira, Haunted Hills. Definitely not on the same level as Mistress of the Dark was. Next up, Krampus. Pretty good holiday movie to watch Christmas season. Next up, Tales from the Hood. Not the biggest fan of this one, but I did think Mr. Sims, the dude in the front here, was pretty creepy. Next up, Prison. Didn't mind this one at all. Definitely takes a minute to get going, but not a bad movie. Next up, Idle Hands. Definitely a stoner horror movie, but a lot of fun. Next up, Ghost Ship. Didn't mind this one. Has a killer opening and love the flashback scene in this movie. Next up, Valentine. Really didn't mind this one at all. Definitely one of my favorite slashers from the 2000s. Next up, Pumpkinhead. Pretty good revenge 80s horror flick. Next up, John Carpenter's Vampires. Definitely pretty gory for being a vampire film, but John Carpenter didn't do a bad job with this one. Definitely like it a lot better than Body Bags and Mouth of Madness. Next up, Species. Pretty good science fiction horror film. I actually need to rewatch this one. Next up, Event Horizon. The first half of this movie is pretty boring, but the second half is pretty insane. Definitely prefer the second half more. Next up, Invasion of the Body Snatchers. Didn't mind this one at all. You know, it does have some boring parts, but the ending scene is great. Next up, Return of the Living Dead. Not a huge fan of this one. I actually prefer the sequel. Next up, Return of the Living Dead Part 2. Actually like this one more than the original one. Next up, Ginger Snaps. Didn't mind this movie at all. Next up, Psycho. Pretty good remake with Vince Vaughn. I know some people either hate it or love it. Next up, Candyman. One of the scariest 90s horror flicks alive. Next up, From Beyond. Really like this one. Probably I like it more than Reanimator because it's more serious. Next up, Motel Hell. Didn't too much mind this one. Kind of overhyped in my opinion. Next up, Body Bags. Not a huge fan of this one in my opinion. I only like the eye story and the gas story. Next up, Dark Man. I've honestly not watched this one yet. It's a blind buy, but I'm going to watch it soon. Next, Dead Heat. Pretty fun 80s horror flick. Another one I discovered from watching In Search of Darkness. Absolutely loved it. Next up, Hatchet 3. Definitely like this Hatchet. It definitely did have some gnarly deaths. Next up, Victor Crowley. You know, I like this Hatchet a lot as well. I know some people are mixed on this one, but I actually enjoyed it. I actually like all of the Hatchet films for the most part. Next up, World War 3D. I've not watched this one yet. It kind of was a blind buy, but I'll watch it soon. Next up, The Thing prequel from 2011. Really enjoyed this one a lot as well. I know this is a hit or a miss for some people. Next up, In Search of Darkness Part 1. Absolutely an amazing documentary on 80s horror, which is my favorite decade ever. Next up, Don't Breathe. I need to give this one a rewatch because the second one came out not that long ago. I remember liking the first one. I just have not watched it in a long time. Next up, Night of the Creeps. Absolutely love this movie. Another one that Tom Atkins just turns into gold. Next up, Survival of the Dead. I've not watched this one yet. I just picked this up because I seen it was George Hay Romero, and I kind of just went with it. Next up, Behind the Mask, The Rise of Leslie Vernon. Not a terrible movie, but not the greatest either. Basically a slasher film that is very meta, but not that bad for the time that it came out. Next up, Feast. Really enjoyed this one. This one is really gory and a lot of fun. Next up, Summer of '84. Really enjoyed this one as well, and the music in this is absolutely phenomenal. Next up, Tucker versus Dale and Dale versus Evil. Pretty fun film. I absolutely love this one. I wish it would get a sequel already. Next up, The Haunting in Connecticut. This movie really creeped me out the first time I watched it as a teenager. I've not rewatched it in years, but I remember being generally creeped out by this movie. Next up, Castle Freak. A lot of fun. Everything Jeffrey Combs and Barbara Crampton stars in, I swear to God, it turns to gold. Next up, Grave Encounters, one of my favorite found footage horror films. Definitely creepy, and they got definitely what they asked for. They wanted Ghost, and they got Ghost. Next up, Burnt Offerings. Pretty good 70s horror film, and the ending to this movie is like a what the F moment. Next up, Final Girls. An amazing film. It really is indeed a love letter to 80s slashers. I had a lot of fun with this one. Next up, Monster Squad. Pretty good 80s horror film by the same director that did Night of the Creeps. He did this as well. Really enjoyed this movie a lot too. Next up, Clown. Very disturbing horror film, but I absolutely enjoyed this one. He should have never put on that clown suit. Next up, See No Evil 2. Pretty good sequel, and I actually like See No Evil 2 a little bit over the first one. Next up, I Spit on Your Grave Unrated. Remake from 2010. Pretty good remake. I really enjoyed this one. They thought they were going to do that to her and get away with it, but she sure showed them they weren't. Next up, Silent House. I've not rewatched this one in a long time either. I remember watching it for the first time some years ago and really enjoying it. I need to actually rewatch it soon. Next, Zombieland. I didn't mind this one. I do feel like Zombieland was kind of one of those movies, though, that was always overrated. I actually liked Shaun of the Dead more than I did this. Okay, last but not least, last row, guys. The Crow. Not a bad movie. Brandon Lee does an amazing job in this movie. A Quiet Place. Like I said before, they're not the best films, but with that being said, they're pretty decent for being PG-13. Next up, Night of the Living Dead. I didn't mind this one. Definitely a George Romero film that is, I will say, pretty up there. Next up, Savage Streets. I did not mind Savage Streets at all. Definitely another one I learned from In Search of Darkness. Really, really enjoyed this one. Next up, Resident Evil Degeneration. Love this one, and I'm a huge fan of the game, so it was really awesome to see Leon and Claire reunite. Next up, Saw the Complete Movie Collection. Y'all already know how I feel about Saw, so I'm not going to even get into it again. I just blindly bought this at a pawn shop for $5. Again, let me go with, up next, Demons 2. Not a bad movie. Definitely a sequel that is definitely greater than its original, in my opinion, and takes place in a high-rise building, and chaos just ensues really quickly. Next up, Maniac Cop. Really enjoyed this one. Bruce Campbell and Tom Atkins truly shine in this film. Next up, Curtains. Really wasn't a huge fan of this one. I found it boring, in my opinion. The only thing that was cool about it was the killer's mask, I thought. Next up, Bloody Birthday. Really enjoyed this one. Those kids were rotten to the bone. Next up, Insidious Chapter 3. I've not watched this one yet. I've only watched Insidious Chapter 1, and that was a long time ago, but I have not watched Chapter 3 or Chapter 2 here, so I'm definitely going to get on that soon. Next up, Insidious. Absolutely loved it. I watched it a long time ago, but I remember really, really enjoying Insidious. I always remembered this movie because the ending was just beyond messed up. Next up, Revenge. Really enjoyed this movie, and it's exactly what it sounds like, Revenge. Kind of the same premise as I Spit on Your Grave, where they thought they were going to do something to her and get away with it, but that was not the case because she got them all. Very good movie. Next up, Ready or Not. Pretty good fun film. Who knew you could turn a classic game into a nightmare? Next up, Beetlejuice. Pretty fun film. I watched this for the first time in 2020 and absolutely loved it. Next up, The Last House on the Left, the original. Was not a huge fan of this film. If you've seen my other video, you already know I like the remake more. Next up, Leatherface. Absolutely a horrible movie. I honestly feel like this does not even belong in the Texas Chainsaw Massacre franchise. Next up, 100 Feet. I blind bought this at a thrift shop, actually. I don't know, the cover looked pretty intriguing to me. I said I was going to eventually watch it. Next up, Mandy. Was not a huge fan of this film, and I honestly turned it off within 40 minutes because I just couldn't do it. Next up, The Devil's Rejects. I'm not a huge fan of Rob Zombie's movies, as I've stated in my other videos. I kind of just blind bought this only because I have A House of a Thousand Corpses, and the other one I am kind of a completist, unfortunately. But with that being said, not a huge fan of his films, like I said before. Next up, The Collector. Really good movie. This is surprisingly is underrated, I feel like. Next up, 30 Days of Night. Pretty good vampire flick, and the vampires in this movie absolutely terrifying. Next up, Brightburn. Really enjoyed this one a lot, man. And this is another one no one talks about. Heavily enjoyed Brightburn. And last but not least, Apartment 143. Watched this a long time ago with some friends on Netflix from Xbox Live and really, really enjoyed this one. And there you have it, guys. That concludes my horror movie collection. Thank you for watching. Please like, share, and subscribe to Elm Street Warrior. Thank you.